Let's talk a little bit about. I want to definitely hit the leaded gasoline and investment products, because these are sort of, like the level of knowledge that I think was involved here, at least in terms of leaded gasoline, as to the dangers of leaded gasoline. It's sort of astonishing in a way. I mean, will you tell us a story of leaded gasoline? Because I have some familiarity with this, where the as far as I remember, the guy who invented it was like, hey, wait a second, this could be a problem. Right? I mean,
oh, well, more than that. Yeah. I mean, basically GM was working on trying to make cars more powerful. And in the 1920s, cars had a problem with knocking. And they wanted to be able to make bigger engines, and so they wanted to solve the knocking problem. And one of their chemists figured out that if you put a little bit of this lead-based chemical, lead tetraethyl, they called it, into the gasoline, the knocking went away. So that was pretty cool, and they were very excited about it. But this was lead, and people had known since antiquity that lead affects the mind. And it was by then already the most conspicuous industrial poison, and people knew that it built up in the body, and people got lead poisoning. So when the news that they were going to do this got out, they got a lot of pushback from public health experts in academia. They got a letter from the Surgeon General saying, in this sort of very polite fashion, since we know this is a poison and it builds up from lots of tiny exposures over time, is this really such a good idea? And basically the scientists for GM wrote back and said, well, we haven't really tested this. We don't really have any evidence, but we don't think it will be detectable. So it's this kind of, if you can't see it, it's going to be fine sort of situation. And this ended up in the newspapers because there was a very spectacular series of poisonings at one of the plants making tetraethyl lead right outside of New York City, a Standard Oil plant. And people suffered there from what was referred to as violent insanity from being exposed to the product put into the gasoline. This is not what comes out of the tailpipe later. But that got a lot of attention to this issue of putting lead in the gasoline. There were big conferences, one big conference, frankly, that the Surgeon General held, brought in the industry, brought in the public health authorities, and the industry basically said, first of all, they got up and said, hey, we have no bias on this issue, and if you suggest otherwise, you're insulting us. And that it's actually men of medicine who work for the company who are controlling this issue, and if they see any evidence showing a real harm, we'll take this out immediately. And basically the conference ended up saying, well, okay, we don't really have evidence to shut you down right now, but it's really important that we keep track of this issue, that we watch it over time. Congress should appropriate money to study this over time. Well, the only groups that actually studied this over time was the actual industry making the leaded gasoline. They ended up dominating the research. And of course, they never found a problem. And they ultimately had a theory that was quite dominant, that having a certain amount of lead, a very high amount of lead in your body, was perfectly natural and perfectly harmless until you crossed a line and suddenly you had clinical poisoning. So, this was in the 1920s. And so much was known, so much was predicted. Then the issue was ignored for 40 years until the 1960s, when a scientist actually trying to figure out the age of the Earth, a geochemist, was studying lead levels and realized, yeah, lead is everywhere, but not because it's natural. Lead is everywhere since we put it in our fuel. And before that, it wasn't everywhere, and made it obvious that we had, in fact, created this low-level poisoning of pretty much the whole world, pretty much generations of people, which affected not just the development of all of us, pretty much all of us born before 1980, but in fact continues to have impacts on adults who were exposed to lead in childhood.
I mean, there's a sufficient, I don't know if it's sufficient, but there is a body of evidence that the reduction in crime that we've seen nationally and internationally is a function of essentially outlawing lead in gas.
Yes, that's a really interesting theory, and there is evidence. I find it very interesting. I've seen one study finding otherwise, and I didn't feel competent to resolve those studies. So I hope we continue to look into this. But we do know that lead not only diminishes IQ, but makes it harder for people, made it harder for kids to function in school, made it more likely that they would end up in trouble with the law, was associated with anger issues. So it really should not be any big surprise if some of that crime wave that has been diminishing since the 90s was in fact related to having poisoned generations of people.
All right, let's talk about the investment products that led to the financial crash in '08. I mean, I think there's a decent just today, I guess the Fed, or yesterday, the Fed announced that it was going to back corporate bonds, essentially corporate loans. There is a real concern that there is this sort of animal out there, financial instrument, collateralized loan obligations as opposed to debt obligations. It was the CDOs that, many people say did us in the financial crisis. And that there's a similar sort of securitization of really bad corporate loans that are out there. The Fed stepping in right now. I don't think that's a coincidence, but give us a sense, because I'm really curious. I mean, one of the things that let's in the context of the financial crisis. I mean, I know that there's like sort of an arrogance that a lot of these folks had, and that they just thought, well, I think it ranges from like, I know what I'm doing, you don't. It's too complicated for lay people to understand, to like, I know I'm going to make money and I don't care what happens beyond that. But also, I guess I'm really just curious. I know there's, situations in discovery where you find like people are very aware of the consequences. They know that things could turn horrible and they still sort of justify it to themselves. Talk about that in context of the '08 crash.
Sure. By the way, I do want to stress that in almost all of my chapters, I'm focusing largely on public denials because I think it has a really important impact on the social norms around how we understand truth. I think it's corrosive in ways that just hiding a secret in your secret documents isn't. But we do have some documents from the financial crisis that give you an idea of some of the things that were going on behind the scenes in their minds. Certainly, there was denial about the fact that there was a housing bubble, denial about the fact that there were these ridiculously low and dangerous lending standards, denial about the ability to take really risky subprime loans and turn them into investment products that were supposed to be safe. But I think one of the biggest and most important areas of denial associated with the financial industry was simply their denial that they needed to be regulated. This notion that somehow they could manage risk themselves and in the public interest, and that is how we ended up deregulating that industry, taking apart the Depression era regulations, and that is what blocked us from regulating derivatives, even though people knew that they were incredibly complicated and nobody really understood them, and therefore they were dangerous. And then, of course, there was just this really general sense that it is fine to exploit people, that, sort of celebrated greed and argued that people who made ridiculous sums of money really deserved it because, well, I guess because they could get it. And so those are all the areas of denial that I discuss in that chapter.